Right, let's stay with that now. Could the Russia-Ukraine conflict result in a sharp rise in fuel and food prices? Senior research fellow at the Trade Collective Lebohang Pheko joins me now to have that conversation. Aslebo, good evening and thank you very much for your time. If social media is anything to go by, a lot of South Africans are saying, hey, South Africa, stay out of this. It has nothing to do with you. Let these two countries fight it out. But if you look at the impact of this conflict on a possibility, particularly on energy costs and therefore to food costs as well going up. Should South Africa, just purely based on those two reasons, at least say something about this?
Look, I'm not sure what there is to be said, and I think that what I've also been looking at and discussing with many other colleagues is the notion of consistency in our international relations footprint and our consistency in our international relations outrage. So, for example, in as much as Ukrainian lives are important and they matter, so do Palestinian lives, so do Yemeni lives, so do Swati lives right here next door to us, so do Mozambican lives, and there, as we are aware, conflicts and all sorts of incursions going on, humanitarian crises going on also in those contexts. So I do think that this hierarchy of which life is more important and which conflict we deem to be of greater importance needs to be subjected to the principles of our own international footprints, African Union protocols, and at all times African interest in all of those situations. So that would be my immediate comment on that, is that many lives matter, as do Ukrainian lives.
Yeah. Global agricultural markets obviously going to be impacted on that. So is this something that really, as South Africa, will just have to sit and watch? There's really not much we can do. Or is there something that we could do to cushion consumers in the country?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because, you know, not only is it about the fuel prices, and as you are aware, the AA has already predicted that there are going to be record high prices, fuel prices this month, and that's just not only across South Africa, but also across many of our trading partners, across the African continent. And I think what we should also be careful to do is to isolate ourselves from the rest of from other contexts. So if there are fuel price increases, as well as which of course leads to agricultural increases because of the cost of fertilizer, the cost of energy to run farms and to run the farming enterprises, but also the cost of imports as well. So wheat, sorghum being very important, very, very important key imports that come both from Russia and from the Ukraine. In fact, African countries last year imported $4 billion worth of agricultural products from Russia, and about 2.6 billion, which is quite significant for a much smaller country, from the Ukraine. And I mean, Egypt was the largest importer. Sudan was a very significant importer. Tanzania, Algeria, and so forth. So in all of this, we are looking at the possibility that as food prices increase across African continents, because wheat, sorghum, these are very staple foods for many of us, we can also begin to anticipate inflation. And in anticipating inflation increases across countries, we could also potentially begin to anticipate or to plan for the volatility of currency, which in turn might have an impact on our own import-export, the cost of doing business within the continent as well, and also the capacity of many countries to even receive our own exports, because you know, they may basically have less money available in their own fiscus. I don't predict that this is going to drag on and on and on, you know, for months and months or years and years like Afghanistan or a situation like that. But I certainly think that we can see just over the past 5 days of this, that it has already had a significant impact. As much as we are geographically far away, as you rightly say, this is a globalized world, for better or for worse.
Yeah, globalized world, as you put it. Normally they speak of the global village when they speak of the interconnectedness of people through the world of technology. But is this the downside of the global village, the interconnectedness, and how, as you put it, a ban of Russia from the banking system of the world like SWIFT could begin to show itself in South Africa?
Yeah, so I think it's a downside of a very market-driven, Western-led international trade architecture, where I think developing countries and developing regions, and I say that with caution, but the global South particularly, have not fared very well, mainly because this is not an architecture of our own design, and often because, of course, the terms of that design are not favorable. They are often a reinscription of extremely problematic colonial relationships, where oftentimes, the European Union, the US, and some of the Asian countries, Japan, significantly behave in their own interest and also almost behave as though they are owed some kind of free market access or access benefits to key African countries. So you'll see that in the very paternalistic trade relationships and other relationships, between France and for example, and former French colonies across West Africa, but even to some extent between the European Union, particularly the UK, and former Commonwealth countries and English-speaking countries. So I do think that what this illustrates is that as much as it's a village, some citizens and some residents in that village set the terms in ways that are not particularly favorable to the rest of us. And as always, not all nations are equal, and it's animal farm out there. And as African countries, we really ought to be looking much more inwardly around our own trade architecture, trading within and amongst ourselves, increasing the market value of what we produce, and not really focusing on sending raw products overseas, but rather sending finished products, setting the terms of our own pricing, making sure that we're able to rationalize and capitalize on the commodities dividend that we have on this continent and set our own prices. But that takes a whole shift and realignment away from trade expectations, away from aid conditionalities, and of course away from the idea that our citizenship and our polity in global politics is lesser than and less important than the European Union or the US, for example.
Yeah. We'll continue in a moment with Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective Lebohang Pheko, and we ask the question, does this put the economic recovery process in a precarious position? Stay with us. The Russia-Ukraine crisis and its impact on the economy here in South Africa, and possibly does it put the economic recovery plan in harm's way? We have with us Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective Lebohang Pheko. Part of the elements or the pillars of our recovery is, of course, an increase in foreign investment. We're looking at, I think, 1.3 trillion that should come from outside countries. I'm not quite sure how much of that we expect to come from Russia, and how does this put the economic recovery plan in harm's way?
So there are quite a few scenarios for the economic impact of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I think that it depends on which scenarios are taken by the different role players and stakeholders. So the sanctions could potentially have the impact of them curbing foreign exchange transactions quite significantly. It could also prevent access to technology and components. The other piece of this is that we've already seen that the cost of imports and even the volume of imports, the key imports that I mentioned, such as wheat and sorghum, which we rely quite significantly from, particularly across the East Africa belt and the Horn of Africa, those could be hampered by up to 36%, which is very significant. There's also the strong possibility that the Ukraine may not be able to export if the blockade continues as well. Another piece of this, of course, is the impact of the falling ruble in Russia and the rising inflation there, and what that might mean in terms of their own balance to trade deficit, and of course the shrinking of their own trade space as well. So this could, of course, trigger or potentially elongate some sort of a recession, and also disrupt the very fragile, it has to be said, recovery. The fragile but sure recovery that I think many countries, including South Africa, have been gently and gingerly.
Oh dear, I seem to have lost that connection there. We're in conversation with Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective Lebohang Pheko, looking at the Ukraine-Russia crisis and its impact on the South African socio-economic landscape. Right, we'll try and make that connection, but let's look at this now. The public sector wages now, the National Education, Health and Allied Workers Union has been dealt another blow after the Constitutional Court upheld the 2018 Labour Court ruling on the public sector wage bill. The union approached the court seeking to overturn the earlier ruling that government had the right to pull out of the multi-year wage bill it had with the public sector unions. Now, in last week's budget speech, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana said the wage bill accounts for 35% of the total budget, and of course those are the remarks that come from government and that it cannot afford to review wages upwards. All right, let's take you back now to that conversation, joined by Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective Lebohang Pheko. So I was saying the manifolds of the economic recovery, and you mentioned, for example, the pressures around the supply chain. Is there a positive there? Is there something we can take advantage of? Because the finance minister, in fact, was asked this question, but it was still too early in the day. He said, well, I don't know. It could be pressure on the imports, pressure on the exports, but there are also maybe some opportunities that could benefit because of the shortages maybe in Europe, where we could take advantage of that and begin to supply in those particular areas.
Well, I mean, the one thing, that's an interesting point, Thabo. I mean, the one thing is that I think it also does offer us the opportunity to rethink our own commodities footprint. And I'm not entirely sure why it is that, as most African countries, we don't take the opportunity to exercise some sort of national sovereignty of the cost and the volume of tariffs and costs of our natural commodities. And I think when there is scarcity, particularly in the global north, that gives us the opportunity to set our own prices, to set our own volumes, and to set the terms of engagements a bit more vigorously. We've been here before, though. We rarely take those opportunities. So, I mean, even during the Iraq and Iran wars, where there was the oil prices were hampered significantly across Europe. In fact, the genesis of those wars, as you know, was around the dollarization of oil prices. We still didn't really step into the gap, including oil-producing countries on this continent. And I think this we really need to rethink the ways that we do trade and the ways that we transact mutual benefit and value chain beneficiation within and amongst ourselves on the continent. We've got Angola, which is an oil producer. We have Nigeria, which is an oil producer, among quite a few others. And we've got, several of the highest oil producing states are on this continent. And yet it doesn't feel like it, And I don't think that in the 5 days that that the UK and Ukraine have been at war, that we're going, that there has been any real move to rethink that at policy, at national and regional policy level. We already have agreements even within SADC which speak around mutual beneficiation of energy supplies and energy resources, many of which unfortunately are gathered in dust as beautiful coffee coasters. And I think that our problem is with implementation. I'm not optimistic that we're going to take advantage, as you say, and that we're going to be able to galvanize our creative imagination to think around what we offer to the northern world in a moment like this.
Yeah. You speak on reflection, for example, on the lessons to be learned around the unity of the European Union. What else can we learn from this situation as a bloc, as a region now, that we should actually, post this conflict, be able to adequately prepare ourselves?
And that's a really fantastic question, because I think over the last few days, there has been a plethora, and I know that you also, you follow social media quite strongly. What is African unity? What is regional unity? What is our positionality in relation to the BRICS formation? And I think that it's an important formation, but I think that it's also worth noting one more time with feeling that is not a political grouping. It's an economic grouping. And not only is it just an economic grouping, its origins are not even per se homegrown. This, as you know, is an idea, an anagram. BRIC was basically an anagram that came off of a laptop at Goldman Sachs in New York. And I think that, I was concerned even when, at the time when South Africa became the S among the BRICS, that this could potentially mean that we were diverting important funding, energy, resources, and ideation towards away from formations like the SADC, as problematic and as clunky as it might sometimes be, but it's ours, it belongs to us, and we live here, away from the African Union, away from even potentially the African Development Bank, and so forth. Notwithstanding that South Africa has one of the largest investment footprints on the continent, and this is, we don't give ourselves enough of a pat on the back on that. In terms of soft loans, we actually have a footprint that rivals the very same one as China on this continent, and what we've invested as members of these other as members of these other formations is extremely significant. And that said, on the same hand, what we have invested in the BRICS formation is about $80 billion going outwards. So that's to infrastructural support in just building up this institution. What we have received inward as an inward investment, Thabo, is about 17 billion. I mean, there's such a massive disconnect. So I think that when you speak about the opportunity for African Union and the African solidarity, bearing in mind that, of course, even the idea of European nationalism and European unity was borrowed heavily from the OAU. So what we should be doing is going back to ourselves and rethinking really some of the principles of what the African Union is supposed to be doing in relation to Aspiration 4 of Agenda 2063, but also how we want to position ourselves to promote, promote dialogue-centered approaches to conflict prevention and the resolution of conflicts not only on the continent but beyond the continent, especially where our interests are at stake, and where I think we fail is in not understanding that our interests are important everywhere in the world. And this is why, as offensive as the notion of America first is, and of course we are not imperialists, and that comes from quite a toxic place, but I mean the notion of really putting one's foot forward and saying, what is our skin in this game? Those are very important conversations to have. I think it's with great distress that many of us are watching African students, including South African students, being subjected to racial and racist abuse in Ukraine, and not being quite, I think, a delayed reaction in them being extradited back to places of safety, and how then we should be able to have a nuanced view to say, look, even though we disagree with what is happening in Ukraine, whether we do or do not, I don't have a strong view on that. We cannot, on the same hand, turn a blind eye to the racism and the other forms of oppression that are going on within this situation. So as a bloc, we have to be very clear and linear about what our interests are on the international platform and in any of these contexts.
Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective, Lebohang Pheko, appreciate your time as always. Thank you for coming through tonight here on In Focus.